Welcome to Primal Girl Wellness and Down to Earth Astrology. This is Miss Jenny, and I am your astrologer. And today's video, we're going to talk about the symbolism of astrology and understanding it in the context of mental and emotional health and depression. So for those of you who are looking for something light and fluffy and entertaining, you're going to want to tune out and come back a little bit later. Okay, so for those of you who are still here, before we get started, we need to go over some groundwork, some foundational stuff about astrology and the language of astrology before we can get into other things. So the first thing is to understand that when we talk about astrology and we talk about the planets and the signs and the aspects, what we're really talking about are symbols, things that symbolize things. It's not a literal thing. When we talk about identity and profiles, who am I in terms of astrology, we're looking at the symbolism involved. So the three primary planets we're looking at, especially when we're dealing with things that have to do with mental health and emotional health and depression and keeping ourselves afloat while we're trying to manage our depressions, is the sun, the moon, and Mercury. The sun represents identity, and the search for identity and the need for identity is present in every single person. If you look at some of the more extreme, we see these examples around us all the time, people that are just way out there, right? One of the things that you'll find that is a common, consistent denominator is these are people who are desperately seeking an identity that is more in keeping with how they see themselves, or in ways that uplift and validate themselves and make them more respect worthy than their current identity without this thing that they've adopted. Okay. Identity is extremely important, and without a strong sense of identity, it's very, very easy for people to feel lost, disenfranchised, vulnerable, confused, like a boat without rudders. You're just kind of floating around at the mercy of everything. So the drive for identity starts from infancy and works well into adulthood and sometimes even to late adulthood. The ego and identity are the same. So it's not ego like, oh, I am the great I am. It's ego in terms of who am I? And that is the sun in the chart. So when you look at the sun in the chart and you look at the placement of it in by house or by sign or by aspect, these are things that modify how this ego need or identity need, because they're the same thing, ego and identity, how these things are going to be best served in terms of forming, right? Things that are going to feel most natural and most authentic for that person as they embrace or come into their identity. The second planet that we look at when we talk about mental or emotional health and depression is the moon. The moon is literally the ebb and flow of life. It's how we connect. It's the emotional body. So when we look at the moon symbolizes the things that we need to feel connected to life itself, to other people, where we are most vulnerable and most needy and where other people are most important, and the ways in which we get our emotional food. When people are not emotionally healthy, right, for any number of reasons, which could be anything from lack of emotional nourishment when they were growing up during their important developmental years, or it could be something more immediate and circumstantial, like grieving, losing someone very important to them, losing very important relationships. These are moon functions. So taking care of our moon and feeding our moon, which is the same as taking care of our emotional body, is very, very important in terms of managing mental and emotional health, especially when we're dealing with depression. The third planet is Mercury. Mercury is the planet that rules the mind and the thinking process, the here, the now, everything right in front of us from moment to moment. Mercury is very much about perspective, right? So Mercury shows us how we more naturally gravitate in terms of thinking and processing information. Mercury is the information from moment to moment, day to day, person to person that comes in and out, like in one ear and back out the other. Okay, or sometimes out our mouth if you're on Facebook, because everybody on Facebook knows everything. So These are symbols. These things symbolize parts of the human experience. And these particular planets, these 3 planets, Sun, Moon, Mercury, are extremely important when we talk about managing ourselves and navigating through the deep, troubled waters of depression or grief or sadness. The other thing that we have to understand is that uh, we need to use the right language to describe our experiences. It's perfectly normal to feel sad about things. Being sad is not the same thing as being depressed. Okay, being really sad, still not the same thing as being depressed. To have grief, to grieve something is a very real and legitimate thing. To feel like you're grieving or you're feeling grief, is a very specific kind of feeling, and we should give it the language that goes with it, right? So if you've just lost a major, very important part of your life, whether it's a person or a situation, or something that brought you solace or something that upheld your sense of identity, feeling grief or grieving that is a very, very valid feeling, but we should also call it what it is, grief, right? We're experiencing grief. Depression, on the other hand, is like the mother of all sadness. Now, the thing about depression, and understand, I'm not telling anybody what is or isn't valid in terms of their feelings. I'm just saying we should use the correct language to identify these things because words have power. Depression can come from any number of things, from chemical imbalances to circumstances, and to people, being surrounded by people or giving you a reason to be depressed. It could come from having lost or never finding a sense of identity. It could be from being emotionally starved. It could be from a poor perspective or a lack of perspective, lack of good input from the world around you to help you keep perspective, But the difference between depression and grief and sadness is that depression tends to last much longer. And once you're in it, it feels like you're kind of drowning in an ocean and you can't see any dry land in sight. And it makes it very, very difficult to find a way to navigate through it. So it's not just that we're despairing, it's depression can be very paralyzing for long periods of time. So if you are indeed experiencing depression, it's important that you don't rely on one thing like astrology to help you figure out how to address this. But it is better and probably more effective if you take a multi-prong approach and use multiple things that work well together to help you navigate that ocean of despair and depression that you might find yourself in until you can get to some dry ground and get back on your feet. So here's where the astrology comes in. If you're dealing with depression, right? And depression means it's not a specific event or person that has brought this on. It's a whole bunch of factors, some of which you may not even be able to identify, because it could also be internalized rage. It could be that you're angry or rageful about something, but it's safer to turn that and direct it inwards at yourself and blame yourself, hold yourself, on the cross, as it were, rather than actually deal with the thing that caused you to feel this way in the first place. Don't discount that. In situations like this, one, good, strong, professional help or even a support group is extremely important. You need people around you who know what's going on or have some appreciation of it and can support you and stabilize you during these times. So make sure you ask for that and go search it out. With the astrology, we want to look at the sun, the moon, and the Mercury in terms of bracing ourselves so that we can, hold up against these things. We want to create these bulwarks, to kind of protect us. So the first thing is when you look at the sun in your chart, you want to think about what are the things in my life that are feeding my identity, that support and nurture and validate the identity that I see for myself. Somebody with a sun in Aries has a very different sense of identity than someone with a sun in Pisces. These are very, very different expressions, and their desire and needs in terms of validating their identity or having an identity that makes sense to them, right? And listen, at the end of the day, your identity only has to make sense to you. For those two individuals, they are very, very different. Okay. So, and we're going to get into all of this in another video. I just want to keep this one kind of short. The moon has a lot to do with the emotional body. So the moon is where we need things from the world around us, from the people around us. This is the emotional food that keeps us healthy enough, that we can endure what we need to endure to kind of get through things. If you've ever been hungry, like a hungry stomach does not think clearly. So the moon is where we connect with other people and how we connect and the things that make us feel better. And remember, depression is as much a feeling as it is anything else. And many things in our life, whether you want to believe it or not, many things in our life are driven by our feelings, not our rational thinking. In not Ayurvedic, sorry, it's late. My insomnia is killing me. In Eastern astrology, from India, Vedic. In Vedic astrology, the moon actually has more importance than the sun, which makes a lot of sense because the moon is the daily ebb and flow of life. It's the emotion, and we are emotion-driven creatures. We're driven by our feelings first and our rational thinking second. So the moon is extremely important, and we have to find ways to fortify our moon so that we can feel okay and nourished enough and stable enough, that we can weather little ups and downs. So when we look at the moon in our chart, we're looking at things that will help us feel better or give us enough fuel, emotional fuel, to kind of keep it together until we can get to the next solution or stopgap. The third planet, which is Mercury, is perspective, right? So Mercury is extremely important because Mercury is how we process information. Somebody with Mercury in Libra, for example, is going to process information very differently than somebody with Mercury in Capricorn. It's very much about perspective and information processing. So one of the things that's very important is we also need to look at our Mercuries and see where our Mercuries are being supported. And if we're doing things that are in alignment with the natural expression of our Mercuries. If you have Mercury in Pisces, chances are, aside from being probably a little musical, you're actually probably really good at math. You might even be hyper rational. I know, little known fact, right? So the thing about it though is if you have Mercury in Pisces and you're really good with numbers and you're, kind of on the hyper rational side, you're going to have a very difficult time working in environments where the emphasis is not on accuracy and numbers and logic, but on social connections and all the social relationships, and the office relationship sort of stuff. There's a lot of those jobs, right, where the relationships between people are more important than the actual work. So for somebody with Mercury and Pisces, that would not be an environment that is conducive to how they process information. It's going to make it very, very difficult. The other thing is that your Mercury is about perspective. So Mercury needs input from the world around it so that it has a more balanced perspective. And if you're not getting that, it's going to be very difficult. People who have their Mercuries challenged because other people's Mercuries are in symbolically challenging relationships with their Mercury, well, they all serve very valid purposes in your life, but it's very difficult to hear the message through all the noise and the static because you're not speaking the same language. So finding ways to support and kind of shore up our Mercury will help us get the information and input that we need from other sources to round out our perspective and give us a much better sense of how to look at something, right? So when you look at your chart, before we get to the next video, I want you to look up your sun, your moon, and your Mercury, just by sun. We don't need houses, and we don't need degrees, we don't need aspects, just the signs. And in the next video, we'll talk about things that help support those planets and specific signs. And then you can take that and examine for yourself where you may or may not be getting enough of that for yourself. And if you're not getting enough of what you need, that's absolutely going to contribute to escalating or making even worse, right? The depression and the crazy train thinking that you might find yourself dealing with. So that is your homework. I will see you in the next video. Now, remember, if you are struggling with depression, or mental health issues or emotional health issues, not always the same thing, right? You can be emotionally battered, and not necessarily have any psychological diagnosis. Okay. Life will do that to you. If you're in this position, again, you want to find strong, qualified professional help to help you get through this and to give you whatever tools and supports that you need to help make this passage a little less volatile. And there's no shame in asking for help. So the astrology will help augment that or improve whatever you're doing. But at the end of the day, if you're dealing with significant challenges to your mental or emotional health, you need proper guidance from people who are much more experienced in helping to stabilize folks who are in crisis. All right. So now I'm going to go try and get some sleep. And I'll see you guys in the next video.